How's it going, folks? Welcome to part two of my lecture. I'm not sure what happened. I was recording and I finished off the lecture, but for whatever reason, I forgot to hit the record button. So that's my fault. So here I am recording a part two. But anyways, where I last left off was I was talking about the influence. What are some of the things that would influence the myths of Mexican food as being something that is a product of mestizaje, or both Spanish and indigenous intermixing or influence? But surprisingly, we see that many of these mestizaje discourses do not come uh, from the early, at least not from the early 19th century, right? Because in the 19th century, we see a lot of male authors, male writers that are talking about Mexican cuisines, but they're not focusing on this subject of mestizaje. Uh, and um, and instead, what we will see is that the authors who do contribute to these discourses of mestizaje are actually women, and so we'll get into that in just a bit. But in the 19th century, what is it that we see? We see these discourses of what makes food Mexican or what makes Mexican food unique. And we see the publication of the first Mexican cookbook in the year 1831. We have the publication of El Cocinero Mexicano, or the Mexican Chef. And we see that this is the beginning of many cookbooks that were written in the 19th century. And one trend that we do see at this time is that most of these books are written by male authors. Many of these male authors tended to also express their political views or their political leanings. These authors tended to be part of the liberal intelligentsia. They were folks who were educated, and they did not consider themselves conservatives. And as a matter of fact, we see that in these cookbooks, they also use these cookbooks as a way to also make political commentary, espousing conservative beliefs and ideals in Mexico. But one thing that the liberals did have, at least the liberals in Mexico, one thing that they did have in common with the conservative class in Mexico was that regardless if they were conservative or liberal, the intelligentsia still did not look at the indigenous population optimistically. For the most part, they felt that the indigenous population should simply assimilate into larger Mexico and forget their indigenous languages, forget their customs, and become part of this Mexican nation, right? This sort of melting pot. Um, and so perhaps it's no surprise that when you're reading these cookbooks that's written by the Mexican intelligentsia at this time, is that they are instead calling for an imitation of European cuisine. And for that matter, they're leaning more towards French taste, right? More French dishes, because they feel that that's what will help to modernize them, right? Because again, keeping in mind that the Mexican nation has embraced, right, French style ideals, right, of democracy, and more Western style government, right, in the form of democracy. And so with that, right, came this idea of adopting Western or French foods by extension. And so as a consequence, we see that they tend to ignore indigenous foods because they look down on indigenous foods and ways of life as backwards. And so for the most part, these Mexican authors who are writing these cookbooks ignore indigenous foods, and they do not use indigenous ingredients in these cookbooks. So, what is it that changes exactly? In contrast to the men, we see that there are also women who are part of the intelligentsia as well, who are also writing cookbooks. And in contrast to the men, we see some different patterns here. We see that women are actually embracing indigenous food ways in their recipe books. That are embracing both old world and new world foods. They also, what makes their cookbooks unique in contrast to some of the ones published by their male counterparts, is that they're also including not just family recipes, they're also including discussing traditions, they're also discussing gossip, um, everyone's favorite topic, right? Chisme. And there's an interesting point that's mentioned here also of how women are, in a sense, also becoming these active agents of mestizo culture, at least when it comes to cuisine, because they're at least emphasizing or acknowledging that indigenous peoples, right, are also making or primary, if not one of the greatest contributors to Mexican cuisine at this time. You even have authors like Vicenta Torres, right, who in her book, right, she has this sort of indigenista section or indigenous section that she calls the secrets of the indigenous classes. And this is where she publishes the recipes on how to make tamales, how to make gorditas, how to make pozole. So interesting when we're looking at how these women's cookbooks, right, these Mexican women's cookbooks that are published at this time, they give us an insight not just into Mexican foodways, but also indigenous foodways in a sense. And also they give us a sense of what do Mexican customs and attitudes about food look like at this time. And so after the post-revolutionary period, what happens? What changes? Because again, going back to the Porfirian era, I forgot to talk about this slide that I have here. This is actually from a YouTube video that I recommend if you're interested if you're interested in learning more about the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. There's a biographics episode on him on YouTube. I'll post a link here for those who are interested. But what's interesting or unique about the Porfiriato and how it relates to these discussions about food and indigenismo and Hispanismo is that Porfirio Diaz is someone who, for the most part, uh, he was somebody who embraced European taste, right? He's someone that we could definitely include in the Hispanista camp, right? He was somebody that embraced European cuisines, European ways of life, even down to the architecture, right? Many of the architecture projects in Mexico City were meant to be reminiscent, right, of European architecture, such as, for example, if you go down the street where the Angel of Independence is, right, the architecture is very reminiscent of European uh, architecture, right? Granted, with an Aztec twist. Um, but anyways, going into sort of what distinguishes foodways after Porfirio Diaz is subsequently ousted out of Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, we see a rejection in the Mexican nation of many of his ideals, right? So during the Porfirian era, there's this sort of embracing of foods that are not indigenous. But now with Porfirio ousted, right, everything that his regime represented, which is of course denounced at this time, um, everything that his regime represents is rejected, right? And so this is also where we have the embracing of indigenous customs and nationalism with the indigenismo movement. And so with that comes the embracing of Mexico's indigenous customs and foodways. So much so that we see that even Mexican politicians at this time are embracing indigenous foods in their banquets. So as an example mentioned also towards the conclusion of this reading, we see that the revolutionary Alvaro Obregón, for example, in 1921, his celebratory revolutionary dinner includes tortilla soup. It includes Mexican rice and also mole poblano. And we see that even in these fancy political get-togethers, they're recognizing indigenous dishes as part of the Mexican cuisine. In the 1940s, we also see the publication of cookbooks that are also recognizing and celebrating tamales and enchiladas as part of Mexican nationalism and also part of Mexico's culinary traditions. And even going into the 1980s, we see that this fixation with Frenchified taste or French foods does actually not go away, but it's retained, but with that Mexican nationalist twist, right? One that is embracing of indigenous customs. So there's Frenchified taste that is very much still something that we still see as a constant going into the modern period. And if you go to Mexico City today, right, you'll still see many of these French restaurants that I think are an interesting sort of um, I would say an interest are part of. I would argue that those restaurants in Mexico City and other parts of the Mexican metropolises, if you go to like the modern Mexican cities, you'll still see many of these French restaurants. But I feel like the ones in Mexico City, in particular, are very much speak to the testament of the long-lasting Mexican fixation, middle class fixation on French foods, right? There's places that still serve French foods, but with a Mexican twist. So in the 1980s, we see that they're starting to publish these cookbooks with French recipes that are Mexicanized, right? With indigenous foodways. So, for example, there's some of these cookbooks include avocado mousse with shrimp. They also have chicken supremes that also feature cuitlacoche, which is the fungus that goes on corn that many folks eat. Very delicious. I love it in my quesadillas. And also, they feature some of these recipes include beef Wellington with chiles, for example. And I would argue that many of these customs continue today, right? And so, and for those of you all who are into sort of who are foodies or whatever, there's an interesting note that's mentioned here on how the cookbook authors even to this day, right, are continue because of this cultural mestizaje, are constantly having these debates about, well, what makes Mexican food authentic or what makes Latin foods authentic, yada yada. Um, they're continuing to stress authenticity, but they're failing to recognize, right, that there's this sort of intermixed nature of foods. Um, but anyways, I have some comments on that, but uh, anyway, I'm not going to go into that. Actually, I'll save that for another lecture. But to conclude, one thing that I do have, I am offering for those of y'all who managed to stick for the second part of this lecture, are some extra credit questions. And so, for extra credits, for those of you who stuck around, you can include this in your responses. For those of you all who are not taking my class but are kind of just hopping into this lecture just for fun, um, you feel free to answer these questions in the comments. But some of the questions I have is food still political? In what ways is food still political? How is food politicized? And are there still racist discourses today concerning food? Um, Feel free to give your responses in the comments. Or for those of you who are in my class, after you finish your 2 paragraph response, answer this question and any one of these questions in at least 5 sentences. You could answer 2 or 3 or one of them, just 5 sentences minimum for those extra credit points. Okay, so that is it for now, and I will see you all in the next lecture. Thank you.